today on Beyond 6 Seconds.
It's all about the person. It doesn't matter what age you are. We have to treat each person as an individual, listen to their story, listen to what they have to say, and judge that person from what they're telling you. And that's all you can do without all of the clutter and the noise and all the assumptions that we make.
Welcome to Beyond 6 Seconds, the podcast that goes beyond the 6-second first impression to share the extraordinary stories and achievements of everyday people. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Gail Tolstoi-Miller, an award-winning dual CEO. She's CEO of Consultnetworx, which provides recruiting, diversity, and unconscious bias strategy services. In addition, she's CEO of Careernetwork, a career and business coaching organization. Gail is also the author of the award-winning book, Networking Karma, a guide on how to network successfully with giving. Lastly, she's a global keynote speaker and gave an unhinged TEDx talk on unconscious bias in hiring. Gail, welcome to the podcast.
Carolyn, thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you on the show today, and especially to learn about your work in unconscious bias. I know you've spent a couple years now learning about it and really helping to advise people on recognizing it and overcoming it. So would love to know, first of all, how would you define unconscious bias and what does that look like in employment?
Oh, gosh. Do we have 3 hours for this one? Okay, so first I want to say that everyone has unconscious bias. It's inevitable because our brains are wired that way. And the reason being is that we are bombarded with 11 million pieces of information at any given time. I mean, that's huge. But we can only handle 40. And the reason why we can only handle 40 is because if we were dealing with all those pieces of information, we would be paralyzed in making decisions. So, when you go to the supermarket and you drive to the supermarket and you're like, wow, how did I get here? You just know how to go. It's autopilot. Well, it's the same thing when we make decisions every single day. Our assumptions, judgments, we use that, all of our history. It's almost like the memory in our brain, our filing cabinet. We use that as our go-to. And when you do that, then you have a tendency to have unconscious bias, which obviously is unconscious. You don't know it, where your assumptions and judgments may not be correct because of your past history, of your experiences. So it happens in all facets of our lives. Media is huge. I mean, we see it every day. I mean, the people that are reporting the news have unconscious bias. And if you look at certain channels, you could see how they spin, the news. And also people that tend to agree with that will gravitate towards those particular stations or newscasters, like the reporters. So that's one area. It's in the judicial system, education system. It's in all facets, but specifically in hiring, it's in every single step of the process. So it's from sourcing resumes. It's the resume itself. It's the phone interview. It's the in-person interview. It's recruiters. And if anyone denies this, they're lying. They do social media investigations. They go on LinkedIn and they go on Twitter, and all they need to do is look at a picture and you can't undo that picture. And if they have a bias against, let's say, a political tweet or the way you look, then that's how it comes into play.
Yeah. It seems like a really huge field and something quite challenging to get a handle on. So what sparked your interest in becoming an expert on unconscious bias?
Well, it's funny that you asked that question because I was really thinking about why am I so gravitated towards unconscious bias? And I've been recruiting for 20 years. And I do think it actually stems back from my childhood. And it's interesting that I'm in a field where I judge people every day because when I was in college, This is kind of funny. I guess I'll say I was like a goth chick. So I was living in New York City, going to school in New York. And, people would judge me by the way I looked. I had, jet black hair, white face, black lipstick, what you see, my kids call it emo, whatever you want to call it. And like I was scaring people. And it was really, really interesting to see how people reacted to me. I get kicked out of restaurants because of the way I looked. People thought I was stupid. Meanwhile, I was going to one of the top colleges in the country. And I just had an attitude of like, this is not right. You don't know who I am. You're shallow. You're making these judgments because of your preconceived notions of what society's telling you, how you were brought up. So I knew at a very young age, I wouldn't say that young, but young enough to know that you can't judge a book by its cover. So I think it really started with that. And I would always keep saying, like, so what? Like, so what if I look like this? How does it affect you? Why? Why does it bother you? Why do you think I'm less than because I look like this? What is it about me that really bothers you? Like, who cares? I'm not affecting your life. So that's kind of how it really started when I did more introspection in that. And, I experienced it myself. And I actually found it kind of fascinating. I mean, obviously the fact that I was dressed like that, I really didn't care. Right? Like I didn't really care what people thought of me. But at the same time, I just thought it was ridiculous. So that's kind of how it started. And then my career progressed and I ended up in the music industry and then got out of that and then went into staffing. And it's ironic that I spent the rest of my career judging people. And I really thought that, wow, I'm going to go into recruiting and make a difference. Like I'm going to change recruiting. I'm not going to use, the typical characteristics of what most companies utilize to judge people. Like, I don't care what you look like. Can you do the job? Let's focus on what matters. But I soon realized that, it's so ingrained in corporate America. It's so institutionalized that it's really, really difficult. So I did everything I could to really bring more awareness to fair hiring practices. But really, I think the turning point for me, the switch of like, I need to really do this for my career and go full throttle is when I was diagnosed with cancer. And I worked, I was recruiting, which is kind of crazy. I was recruiting while in the hospital with a chemo drip.
Wow.
And when you do that, it really accelerated my perception on unconscious bias because I'm sitting there in the hospital feeling so sick. I didn't tell any of my clients. I didn't tell any of my candidates. And I'm on the phone and I'm thinking to myself, this client is not hiring this person because I don't like their shoes. Or this candidate's, complaining about this and this client's worrying about this and not hiring this person over this. And it's like, whoa, let's slow down. This all doesn't matter. And I really started saying like, so what? Like, so what if the person is wearing white pumps, and that's in my TEDx talk, white pumps after Labor Day? Who cares? And I kept saying it over and over to my clients and challenging them that way. That was my way of challenging them. Very easy, 2 words, so what? Who cares? So that's when I really started dedicating my career to unconscious bias. And now I have an online unconscious bias course that was released about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. So how do you help either people or organizations kind of either overcome or be aware of that unconscious bias? I mean, you mentioned that you challenged your clients, but are there other ways that you made them see their biases and come around or think more broadly about people's qualifications?
Yeah. I mean, there's various steps. The first thing is self-awareness and having open dialogue and communication. The company really has to have buy-in into it. At all levels, the entire organization, and they have to hold people accountable. The problem is that companies cherry pick. This is what I call cherry picking. diversity. And some of the top companies that are named one of the top diverse companies in the country, they may have the right numbers. So they may be hiring, they may be on a mission to hire a lot of women or minorities. Okay. And that's great. I mean, that's wonderful. However, they may justify not hiring someone over 50 or transgender. So that is a huge problem as far as cherry picking what your organization wants to focus on as far as diversity. But you can't just choose 2 or 3 things. It's got to infiltrate into all aspects. And it's not just, women or minorities or religion. It's also about diversity of thought. A lot of companies, they get in a place where they hire people like themselves, and that's called affinity bias. So that means we tend to gravitate towards people that we feel comfortable with, that resonate with us, that are like us, that look like us, that think like us. And what happens is that hinders creativity and innovation in an organization. And it trickles down to your customers and clients. Because if you don't have diversity in your organization, and I mean all aspects, as I said before, thought and, gender and everything else, then how are you going to service your clients effectively when your clients or your customers are diverse? And that's why you see it so much in the news, where all these companies have to apologize constantly. Because they're not thinking of those small little things that they don't think about, because maybe they don't have someone being represented in the organization that would think of such a thing. So, but getting back to things that you can do, again, self-awareness. But even with self-awareness, that is clearly not enough. There's something called an IAT test through Harvard that's online, implicit association test that you can take. I also have my So What method that I've come up with. That's part of my course. Also, in order to really, really work, you have to have very comprehensive policies, procedures, and process in place. So whether it's recruiting, whether it's promotions, who gets the projects, compensation, I mean, every little aspect, meetings. I mean, unconscious bias affects, how people act in meetings. You really have to implement that and hold people accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. The best intentions aren't enough to make unconscious bias go away or come to the surface and have it addressed. You really do need all of those people, processes, and systems that support it, because it's something that I think you continually have to be aware and challenge yourself. And, as you said, ask that question, so what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as far as recruiting, I'm a firm believer in taking the names off the resumes when you send it to the hiring manager. There should be no identifiers. There's really no reason for it.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of companies out there now that are doing that as far as, applicant tracking systems are trying to make it bias free. But again, once you have humans in the mix, it's going to happen. But even when you use artificial intelligence, which is being used now for that could backfire also, because artificial intelligence, that's also learned. So what you put in is what you get out. So that could be biased too. So there's no way that anyone can completely eradicate it, but we definitely need to work on it. Without a doubt. People are making poor decisions and judging people the wrong way because of their biases.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you worked with anyone who you've noticed has had a clear, aha moment about their own unconscious bias? Obviously don't name names, but anyone that sticks in your head about they really turned it around, or they just really came to after you had talked with them and totally turned around their hiring lens?
Yes, I'll give you a great example. So a large financial services organization approached me to help them with their unconscious bias. So the recruiter in me, of course, did some research. I went on LinkedIn. And what I noticed was most everyone went to Ivy League schools. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this all about? Like not to knock Ivy League,
Right.
but you certainly don't want to hire everyone from an Ivy League school. That's just ridiculous, right? So they said, well, we want to hire more women and more minorities. And I said, great, I'll help you with that. And, I want you to help us with our unconscious bias and diversity. And I said, well, I went on LinkedIn and I looked at some of your employee profiles and I noticed such a huge amount went to Ivy League. And they said, oh yeah, we're not going to touch that. And I said, why not? Oh, because it's working for us. And I said, well, have you tried recruiting from other schools? No, because this works for us and we're not touching it. And I said to them, look, I would be more than happy to help you. But again, I can't work for a company that's going to cherry pick their biases. If you think you're doing yourself justice, you're not. So you need to look at everything. And I went in there and I had to do some convincing. And I said, look, do me a favor. Start recruiting or start sourcing from other schools that are not Ivy League. Just try it. And they were very, very reluctant. And then finally they did. And they got some amazing, amazing talent. And they really thanked me for it. And they said, thank you so much, because it really broadened our employee population and it just brought a different perspective. So thank you. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That sounds like that affinity bias at play again, where they're just hiring people who are kind of like themselves or kind of like the people who are already at the company. And that's great. You got them to expand their view and really look for people who had different experiences. And it sounded like it really worked out extremely well for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Wow. So relatively recently, I think within the last year or two, you gave a TEDx talk on this topic. Tell me about that whole process. Like, what made you decide that you wanted to give a talk on the TEDx stage, and how did you put together your speech and your focus for that?
Wow, that was crazy. Crazy experience, I got to tell you, but an amazing, amazing experience. I was approached by someone to try out for TEDx. And I tried out. I never thought in a million years that I would I never thought that they would accept me. And I did. And it took months and months of practice, months and months of writing the script, because you have to write it out first. You can't just get on the stage. Like, people think that you get on the stage and it's unrehearsed. It can't it's got to be very concise, because you have to do it within a certain period of time, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 12 minutes. Mine was 10 minutes. So it has to be really well thought out. And I kept writing the script over and over again. And it's funny because it's almost like you hoard your information. Like you become so attached to some of the things that you have in the script, and you're like, I can't let that go, but you have to, right? Some of the things. So yeah, it was just a great experience. And I have to say, it's opened up a lot of doors for me. So I'm grateful for it. It was very challenging, but I did it. And I mean, I would tell anyone, doing a TEDx talk is a great experience. Not easy, but amazing.
Wow, that's great. So what has been the reaction that you've gotten since your TEDx talk got published?
Well, Udemy approached me to create an unconscious bias course, which I told you is released. That's in their business section. I've got speaking engagements. I got clients from it. And it's just brought more awareness. It's been great for my brand, I have to say.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. I'm starting to see more and more people that I know in my network taking the TEDx stage. And it's, as you said, incredibly challenging. It's a lot of work, and you really do have to practice and get, I would imagine, everything from the points that you keep in your speech to the way that you move around on the stage to the way that you dress on the stage as a whole. Like, there's a lot of thought, I would think, that goes into putting that whole package together. So it's a lot of work, but potentially really, really rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's funny you mentioned the attire. I wanted to wear all black, and the person in charge is like, nope, you can't wear all black. You got to put a blue shirt on. I'm like, no. It's like, I'm going to be on video the whole, forever. People are going to see it. I want to wear my all black. Yeah. I guess that still spills over from eons ago. But yeah, no, it was great. And, interestingly enough, in the middle, I forgot a big chunk of my talk.
Oh.
And it's interesting because when you're standing there and there's silence and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to recover? The audience doesn't realize what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But that silence seems way longer to myself than it did to the audience. So they had no idea. And when I look back at the video, I've only seen it once because that's all I could. I don't like looking at myself. So when I saw it, I was like, oh, no one would ever know that I forgot a chunk of my TEDx talks. I kind of just, forged ahead.
That's great. Yeah. And that's, as a side note, that's a great point for anyone who wants to do more public speaking. I think a lot of people worry about missing a part or forgetting the words, but quite literally, whether you're performing on stage, like, I'm a singer and I've occasionally forgotten words to songs versus, giving a presentation, is the audience really doesn't know what's coming next. So it's more of a big deal for you in your head because you've forgotten something, but honestly, the audience has no idea. So as long as you push through it and connect your points, it's still a good experience for them.
Definitely. As long as you know your topic and you're on the stage and you feel passionate and you're into it, then there's no way that you can lose.
Yeah, fantastic. You talked a little bit about the work that you do with hiring managers and corporations around unconscious bias, but I guess for people out there who are trying to build careers, maybe people who are looking for jobs and applying to jobs, what advice would you have for people who are in the job search, who are thinking that there might be some unconscious bias at play? I like ageism, for example, is a huge one. So what advice would you have for people who are applying to, bust those myths in a way that's tactful, that won't totally take you out of the running for jobs?
Exactly. So when I do my career coaching, I actually do a whole hour on how to use unconscious bias to your advantage. Because once you're aware of the different types of bias, then you have to really look at yourself and say, okay, I may be overweight. I'm over 50. And I got to tell you, ageism, I don't care what anyone says, is the biggest form of discrimination going on in hiring. And companies are overt about it. They justify it, and it's not right. But don't mean to go off track there, but I just needed to say that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the affinity bias that we discussed. Knowing that companies want to hire people like them, they want to feel comfortable. I'll give you an example. On my old website, I had a bio that stated that I'm addicted to Diet Pepsi, which is, right, it's just like little facts of myself, okay?
Yeah.
So someone came in, and what did they do? They brought in a 6-pack of Diet Pepsi. Well, I got to tell you, I was like, whoa. I was like floored. That's called, there's two things going on. That's called the halo bias, where someone does something on the interview and it's so amazing that there's a halo over them that anything else they say, they could say they got fired from a job. I mean, I'm going to the extreme.
Sure.
Okay. But that Diet Pepsi just floored me that I can't assess them appropriately because they've got a halo effect. So that person was really smart. Yeah. They played it well because, again, that's also the affinity, right? Using something that is common, and they know that I like Diet Pepsi. They know already that I'm going to have an affinity towards them. I'm going to be happy about that. So candidates, I can't stress this enough. Do your research. Do your research on every single person that you're interviewing with. Go on LinkedIn, go on Facebook, go on Twitter, because guess what? They're doing it to you, right? So you need as many tools in your toolbox to land that job and really do well on that interview. So you want to get to know these people before you go in there and really try to find the commonalities between you and them so they feel more comfortable. And there's affinity bias, so use it to your advantage. Also using cues in their office. So if you interview in their office And let's say they have, I don't know, giant memorabilia, the giant team, football team. And you see it, be like, oh, I'm a Giants fan. I'm not saying to lie about it, but if you truly are, use it in the conversation, and unconsciously, they're going to feel more connected to you. So that's one way. Now, on the flip side, let's talk about the 50-year-old. What are some of the common misconceptions about anybody over 50? Low energy, not up to date on technology, overqualified. They're not going to be challenged. They're going to retire, which is like so ridiculous because people, I mean, in your 50s, most likely your kid is in college and you got to pay for college, right? So there's such a subtle way of dealing with that. Knowing what the objections are already up front, the potential objections. Then what you do is when you're on the interview, you're going to focus and flip it around and say, well, I'm really up to date. Well, you're not going to say up to date, but I've used this technology and that technology, and I've taken extra courses, and I'm an integral part of the team. And I work, crazy hours, and I work in a fast-paced environment. And so all these things you're going to subtly work into the interview and kind of check off the list of all the biases that these people are thinking about, all of the judgments and assumptions they're making about you being over 50. The whole overqualified thing is like, this is what I want to do now. I might have been a director in the department, but now things have shifted for me. I don't want that any longer. I prefer being a manager or an individual contributor. That is where I really want to go, and that's a direction. So you don't want them to say, well, I think you're overqualified. You want to kind of nip that in the bud first, but you don't want to say that, I know you think I'm overqualified, right? So you don't want to go through the checklist. Well, I know you think I'm overqualified. You're not going to say that. Right. Unless they say something to you, then you're going to address it head on. But you don't want to get to that point. You want to really work it in when you sell yourself.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes some of those, specifically for ageism, like the overqualified, is really just sometimes a code word for we think you're too expensive. So for something like that, which is also a bias, how do you address, because you don't want to be like, oh no, I'll take anything sort of thing. How do you address something like that?
I actually think overqualified is not about money. That's not what I find. It's you're too old. It's you're too old.
Oh.
That's what I think. That's what I see. That's it with my experience.
Wow.
Because you could say, they're still not going to hire you. Let's say you say, I'll take $30,000 a year, but you're overqualified. They're still not, if they don't want to hire you, you're over 50, they're going to make any excuse. It's not about the money. Because most of the time when you go on the interview, you kind of know what it is. You know what the compensation is. And quite frankly, no one should shortchange themselves anyway. Right. I mean, yes, companies have guidelines. And if you're not in those guidelines, you're not going to get the job. I wouldn't say you're overqualified. You're just making too much money. Those are totally two different things. You could be overqualified and still be within the salary range.
Right. Oh.
You could be making less, actually. Right?
Yeah.
So actually, there's also a lot of bias in compensation, as we know. But I think if people know their worth and also know that if they were at a higher level position, they can't expect to make the same.
Right.
Right. So I think the best thing to do is try not to talk about compensation as much as possible. And I mean, this sometimes is kind of lame-o, but you could say, I'll entertain your best offer. Because sometimes the person that puts out the first number is the loser.
Yeah.
So let them put out the number first.
Oh.
Because you may shortchange yourself. You may be like, you're so desperate. And then they may give you 100, but you were going to ask for 80.
Right.
And a lot of states now are not allowed to ask what you were making. So there's so much bias, even in the job descriptions, there's bias. I mean, just everything. Our everyday lives, it's just every single thing we do. You buy a car, there's bias. You go to the store, how do you judge the customer? There's bias, how they're dressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you for making that distinction for me. I mean, as you talk it through, it does make sense that even if you were in the same salary range, chances are if they're really holding on to their biases, they, would still be biased against what they're seeing and what they're hearing. So yeah.
Exactly. And I call my clients out when they say, well, they're overqualified. And then I say, okay, so what? So what if they're overqualified? If they want to do this job, who are you? See, this is the problem with corporate America, and this drives me insane. Why are recruiters and hiring managers making life decisions for candidates? They know they're overqualified for the job. So what? If they don't want to do that job anymore or what they were doing, and now they want to do this, who are they to judge how people want to make shifts in their career? And actually, I think it's kind of foolish sometimes not to hire someone who is quote unquote overqualified, because they could bring more value to the organization. And maybe you can use them in different ways that you normally wouldn't if someone wasn't overqualified. I don't understand why companies are so concerned about the whole overqualified aspect. And I get the concern, well, they're going to be bored, they're going to leave, all these stories that we tell ourselves. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, it's not our job to create someone else's story. We need to listen to their story and let them tell it.
It's a great point. You can't make assumptions about people and what they want and what they're thinking, because really everybody's different. You don't know who's going to get bored. Anyone could get bored at a job. You don't know walking in, and it has nothing to do with, are they overqualified? How old are they? Where do they come from, et cetera. So,
it's so true. There's so many variables. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could have a 25-year-old that's bored and wants to move on. The younger generation, they're not going to stay at a company for 30 years. Those days are gone. Mm-hmm. So I almost feel like, and of course, I don't want to be biased and I don't want to judge. And I'm not saying that the younger generation, they're not going to stay at a company for 5 years. Of course, I'm not saying that. But someone who's 25 may say, you know what? I need to move on to the next step. I need to move out of this organization so I can make more money. Someone who's maybe 55 is going to say, you know what? I'm going to just stay at this company for the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but that happens a lot where they want to just stay in one company and kind of finish out. I'm not saying you're going to finish at 65, but yeah, it's, look, it's all about the person. It doesn't matter what age you are. We have to treat each person as an individual, listen to their story, listen to what they have to say, and judge that person from what they're telling you. And that's all you can do without all of the clutter and the noise and all the assumptions that we make, because there are so many assumptions in recruiting, in organizations once you're there. So if we could just take a pause and sometimes really think a little bit more before we act, then the outcome may be better or more fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your goals for the work that you're doing in unconscious bias? What other types of impacts do you want to have in this area?
It's funny. I feel like I'm just getting started. There's just so much on my list. My career's made a turn that I didn't expect. But my next step really is getting more speaking engagements. I just signed up with the Speakers Bureau. So that's really just from a global perspective, getting the word out and just really getting the word out there, how important not only unconscious bias is, but bias as a whole to our society. And especially now, the world can use just a little less bias and just, everyone be more aware of the judgments that you make of other people and situations. And that's really my goal, is just to really get the word out there on a global scale.
Yeah, you're right. You really are just at the start of your journey with this. And yeah, definitely see that there's a lot of impact that you're on your way to be making. And that's really, really exciting. Really great opportunities there. Very cool. Wow. So Gail, thank you so much for being on my podcast today. How can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work and your speaking?
Well, they can go on my LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook page. My email address is gmiller, Miller, Consultnetworx, which I'm going to have to spell because it's tricky. consultnetworx.com. And that's the best way.
Perfect. And I'll put that contact information in the show notes so that people can see it there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
I'm so glad. Yeah. And, as we close out, is there anything else you either want our listeners to know or anything else that they can help or support you with?
Well, I just want to let them know about my unconscious bias course on Udemy. It's great for everyone because the more aware you are, the more that you can use it to help yourself, help your organization. I mean, there's so many ways that you can use unconscious bias to your advantage and just have more self-awareness. So that's one thing. And, just be aware of how you judge people, because I think it's really important. Like empathy is a big part of this, which I didn't discuss. This is my parting words. Think about a time that someone judged you for maybe the way you looked, your religion, your race, whatever it is, and think about how that made you feel. And just think that you're doing that to someone else too, potentially. So I doubt you want to do that to someone else. I just think it's important for all of us to be more aware, to try to work on it because it's continual and it leads to better decision-making. So that's really it.
Yeah, that puts it in perspective. Well, thanks again, Gail. I'm so happy you were on the show, and thank you for sharing your advice and your experience with us. And best of luck with your continued work in unconscious bias.
Oh, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Beyond 6 Seconds. Please help us spread the word about this podcast. Share it with a friend, give us a shout out on your social media, or write a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player. You can find all of our episodes on our website, www.beyond6seconds.com. Until next time.